communications is not just part of the game, it is the game. As a startup, for example, I like to say that communications is the great equalizer. You can be a $1 million or $10 million startup, and if you have really creative and impactful communications, you can achieve the same level of visibility in the marketplace as a company that's maybe worth billions of dollars.
Some might call him a connoisseur in communication, but I'll leave that to them to decide. Welcome to the AOU podcast, where we talk about entrepreneurial leadership in Africa. My name is Savannah Olo, and I'm your guide through getting these gems of knowledge that we drop here every week. If you feel like the content resonates with you, or you might have picked a gem or two with you, do not hesitate to like, share, and comment, and maybe tell us about what you think of the guests that we bring on. Remember that this content is curated for you as our listeners. So find us on various platforms, but to be duly updated on when we upload episodes every week, do follow us on Instagram at AOU Education. Today's guest brings out the most of what we need to do in times of crisis when it comes to communication. So in times of crisis, we always need a sense of assurance that the situation is under control. And this is where our guest today comes in. He ensures that the message you receive does what it needs to do for you. Jim Olson, for 25 years, has been the forefront of telling some of the most compelling business and social impact stories of our lifetime. Along the way, he has helped lead global brands including Starbucks, United Airlines, US Airways, Nissan Motors, Yahoo, and Boeing, just to mention a few, through periods of immense growth, transformation, and disruption. So he currently resides in Mauritius, where he's helping empower a new generation of leaders as an executive in residence and chief communications officer at AOU. This is by far the latest calling in his purpose-inspired career. We might get to touch on that in a few. That spans 50 countries across six continents. So, welcome, first of all. Early on in your career, you led Nissan's digital strategy, including creating its first corporate website, online newsroom, and employee intranet. How challenging was this, given the internet was barely a few days old in the business world then?
Well, first, Savannah, thank you for having me on the program. It's great to be here, and let me just begin by first letting folks know that my heart goes out to everyone who's been touched by this entire situation. It's impacting our whole world,
Right.
and it's, I think, a humbling experience for everybody. To answer your question, as I rewind the clock back to the very beginning of my career and the experience and that I think important time in business in our world as the World Wide Web was coming to fruition, it was a double-edged sword of a period. On the one hand, there were many old school leaders, as I call them, that didn't understand what was happening. And to be frank, many of them didn't want to understand it or make an effort to understand it.
Right.
I can recall a senior executive at the ad agency I was working at the time who called the internet the CB radio of the 90s.
Oh.
Trying to persuade some of these non-internet believers was like trying to, in some ways, explain to someone who felt the world was flat that it's actually round. On the other hand, it was also probably one of the most exciting periods of my career. Those who understood what was unfolding at the time were, in many ways, considered visionaries and experts.
Right.
At a very young age. I was at the time only 24, 25 years old, just starting out my career. And so to be looked upon by folks who were more mature and farther along in their careers and senior executives who did see the future, it was a very exciting time to be only, again, 24, 25, and be sitting in boardrooms with CEOs and other leaders who were trying to understand what was going on.
Wow. I can see you took a challenge and turned it into an opportunity right there. It's great to see how you did that, though. So 2008 was one of the most turbulent economic periods in the commercial aviation industry. As VP of Corporate Communications at US Airways at that time, how did you go through these tough times, for example, communicating changes, dealing with restructuring, labor relations, and employee layoffs?
Yeah. So first, I think it's important to acknowledge that period of 2008 to 2011 and the Great Recession that the U.S. and many other parts of the world were going through. I think now in hindsight, that pales in comparison to what our world is going through today,
Yeah.
and especially for the airline industry. Many of us at that period who were working in the industry believe that period was probably one of the most devastating times for the airline industry. But again, what we're going through now and the devastating impact that it's having on airlines and the travel industry around the world, you can't even compare the period. So my heart goes out to all of my former colleagues and everyone,
Yeah.
all the great aviation professionals that work around the world in that space. Many of them are losing their jobs, and are the ones that are still flying are in many ways heroes. Still be flying planes under these conditions right now. But all that said, it was still a very challenging period.
Right.
Fuel prices were at historic highs. The economy was collapsing under our feet, so many people and businesses were cutting back on their travel significantly. And so I think in this situation and all kinds of situations like it, it's critical that companies and leaders lead with a sense of humanity and transparency. And that's certainly what we tried to do at US Airways when I was there at the time, in terms of how we engaged our employees.
Okay.
It was important to be honest with folks about where things stood and the difficult decisions we were having to make for our teams and for our customers and our business. But it was equally important to give our stakeholders, including our employees, hope that we were making the right decisions that would position the airline to not only survive, but actually to thrive as we came out the other side of this situation.
So, like, sort of giving them a sense of assurance that the situation's under control, right?
Yeah, that it's under control, that it's difficult, and that we understand the pain and the hardship that many of the decisions that not only our airline but other airlines and companies had to make at that time,
Right.
that people were having to undergo, but at the same time, trying to over communicating and trying to explain the reasons why some of these decisions were having to be made. When you have fuel prices approaching record highs, you have to sometimes get creative and do difficult things to ensure the survivability of the airline.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay, so with that said, is there a framework for managing a crisis? Because you served as an advisor on the broad range of issues like aircraft accidents, severe weather conditions, and what have you. The crisis response you led following the 2009 crash of Flight 1549 in New York City, IC Hudson River, is recognized as a model in crisis contemporary management. So maybe you can share some key points that you learned from there, or if there's actually a framework for managing such a crisis.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that experience. We actually, a lot of people called that accident the miracle on the Hudson.
Right.
We had we and lots of and all airlines have very buttoned up crisis plans, but none of us had a miracle plan.
Right.
And so, but all of the same factors and preparation is still required, whether it's a miracle or a tragedy. But nonetheless, it was an extraordinary experience. As communicators, I think when there's a time of crisis in that situation and others, there's a simple protocol that you can follow. And it's actually the same. It's very similar, and it's drawn from the safety protocol that pilots are trained to use when something goes wrong
Yeah.
and catastrophically wrong with their airplane when it's in the air or taking off or landing. And that protocol is based on four key factors.
Okay.
First, aviating. First and foremost, pilots are taught to always keep the plane flying and not get distracted. If you look at most accidents that happen with aircraft, whether they be on the ground or in the air, 90% of them are caused by pilot distraction. They're fiddling with something else or another issue that may be a symptom of a bigger issue, or it may not even be related to flying the plane. And before they know it, something catastrophic happens. So first and foremost, just as pilots have to keep the plane in the air and flying, as leaders, we need to keep our organizations and our businesses and our universities and our countries, if you're a political leader, up in the air and flying, and not be distracted by some of the symptoms that sometimes result from a crisis. Sully did that in the Flight 1549 accident that you're talking about.
Okay.
The minute the birds hit the plane and knocked out both engines as the plane was still climbing into the sky, only about 2 minutes into the flight, he didn't panic.
Right.
He did what great pilots are trained to do. He put the nose down to try to regain momentum. He turned the plane into a glider. And so that was the right thing to do. If he had not put the nose down immediately as he had done, it was very likely that plane would have gone into a stall and had catastrophic results. So he aviated. The second important protocol in any crisis is to navigate.
Okay.
You've got to understand where you are and then where you're going. Just like a pilot, and just like Sully in that situation in January 2009, he took stock of where the plane was over Manhattan, and then identified potential airports to land the plane at. In Sully's case, the only safe place to land the plane was ditching it in the Hudson River, and that was ultimately the right decision. Everyone survived
Right.
that incident. The same is true in business. When you're going through a crisis, the worst thing you can do once you have the situation stabilized is to not think about where you're going to go next. You can't just put your guard down and think that the crisis is over. You need to constantly be thinking about what your next move is. Where are you going to safely land your organization to have the least amount of impact on your employees or your customers or your operation? And then finally, you need to communicate. And you need to communicate in a crisis decisively, honestly, frequently, and with empathy.
Right.
And important thing is that I go back to aviating. If you don't first aviate in any of these situations, no matter how good of a communicator or no matter how good of a navigator you are, it's not going to matter if the plane crashes. So for leaders of all kinds, the guidance is aviate first. Sully didn't communicate with the passengers or the crew in the back of the plane until after he had figured out he was going to land the plane on the Hudson River. And it was at that point, after he had aviated, after he had navigated, that's when he came on the intercom and said, "This is your captain, brace for impact." And finally, it's critical, just like pilots, to be prepared. Pilots go through simulations, through training. Companies need to do the same kind of crisis management preparation and readiness efforts. I like to say that, and I've lived through a lot of crisis situations and highly visible ones, it's not the crises that are stressful. Not being prepared is stressful.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I could see how that could come into play. Failure to plan is sort of a plan to fail.
Exactly. I would totally agree. So preparation. Sometimes it's an inconvenience to do these crisis readiness and preparations drills because it takes time out of people's busy schedules, and there's always seems to be something more important than preparing for something that's unimaginable.
Right.
But you'll be thankful that you did, and you'll learn a lot of lessons before you have to learn them the hard way.
Right. Well, great. So there seems to be a trend in the kind of companies that you work with, or the caliber of companies that you work with. You are the VP of global. You're the VP of Global Corporate Communications at Starbucks, and it ranked fifth of the most admired company in the world, and ranked as one of the most innovative company by Fast Company. That's the same caliber of company that you're working with at the moment, ALU. How essential is a corporate communication strategy and a business news agenda key to startups' growth and recognition?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I worked for a CEO for a while, and he had a great philosophy. He used to say that communication is not just part of the game, it is the game. And I think that's true for any size organization, any organization in any industry, and whether you're working for a publicly traded company, a private company, or a university. Communications is central to your success and your leadership.
Right.
As a startup, for example, I like to say that communications is the great equalizer. You can be a $1 million or $10 million startup, and if you have really creative and impactful communications, you can achieve the same level of visibility in the marketplace as a company that's 10 years, 20, 30, even 50 years older than you, and that's maybe worth billions of dollars.
Yeah.
And so communications is a great way to equalize your reputation and elevate your reputation to play at the same, to play on the same stage or on the same field as other organizations that have been playing the game for years. It's also a great equalizer with employees. Communications and employee engagement, again, is another great equalizer where look at what we're doing at ALU and at ALX and across the AL organization.
Right.
We're attracting some of the brightest and most innovative talent from across Africa and around the world. And there are certainly much bigger, more prominent universities that a lot of these people, staff and faculty could go work for, but they're choosing ALU, they're choosing ALX, they're choosing ALA, not because it's the biggest or the oldest educational institution in the world, but precisely because of the innovation and the impact that we're making, and then ultimately that's being projected around the world, in large part through communications and public relations.
All right. So in that same breath, what's your story behind joining ALU? I mean, it's a young and yet transformative institution. You've worked for like very big brands. So what drew you to ALU exactly?
Yeah, so I turned 50 last year, and when I stepped down from my post as the Chief Communications Officer at United Airlines,
Right.
I was ready to, in many ways, to stop fueling my ambition and start refueling my soul.
Okay.
I didn't know what that opportunity was going to be. I set up a consulting firm and worked on a variety of different projects and served as an interim CEO at an organization. And so it wasn't until about exactly a year ago that I read the Fast Company article about ALU and about Fred that ALU popped onto my radar.
Right.
And it was at that point I knew this was it. It was like a light bulb going off in my head. I had set up the situation and the conditions to keep my eyes open for this kind of opportunity, and it literally landed in my lap as I was reading this article. And I knew I wanted to do this because 20 years ago I had I'd gone to Kenya to work on my capstone project for my MBA at a nonprofit school in Eldoret. And I promised myself, and I was only about 30 years old at the time, I promised myself that I would make it back to Africa to make even a bigger impact. I didn't know when it would be. I didn't know where it would be. It took me 20 years to ultimately make it back. But as the saying goes, you can leave Africa, but Africa never really leaves you.
That's
And
very true.
and so I heard the calling, and I answered it. And I think most importantly, it was we're talking about communications and stories, and
Right.
I love telling stories. And as I dug in and started to learn more about ALU and the mission that we were on, it was too compelling and too rich of a story, too important of a story not to be part of.
Right.
And so I think that, and it's over the last year that I've been working with the African Leadership Organization, that's come to fruition. It's not only an important story for us to tell about ALU and for ALU's sake, but it's a story that needs to be told for Africa, and there's a need to shift the narrative that currently exists about Africa from, in many cases, what's wrong with Africa, to an exciting what's next, and too big of an important story not to join.
Right. Okay. So, speaking of impact and also telling compelling stories, why do you think it's relevant for young entrepreneurs on the continent to tell compelling business and societal impact stories at this point in time? And just maybe to follow up on that, how do you craft a compelling story? So maybe you could start with why you think it's relevant to be telling such stories.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that Africa is at a critical inflection point.
Right.
And I like to say that sometimes the best inflection points, as hard as they may be or as challenging as they may see, are also great reflection points.
Okay.
And in many cases, the best stories emerge from times of reflection. And I think for all of us who are working here in Africa, especially young leaders and young entrepreneurs, it's just an incredible time to be telling the stories of possibility, and also to tell the stories of consequence. These are the stories of leaders and young leaders and the small businesses on the continent that are making decisions and offering products and services and hiring people that have amazingly positive consequences for the future trajectory of the continent.
Okay.
And so in terms of what goes into a great story,
Right.
a lot of times I like to think about it through the lens of what we're doing at ALU. We talk about doing hard things here at ALU,
Yeah.
but the best stories are often the hard stories to tell. And what I mean by that is that if you think about the best stories that you like hearing about or watching, whether they be through on the news or whether they be in the theater, there is usually a high degree of vulnerability that goes along with those stories. And a lot of people think, especially leaders, I'll speak for myself, that vulnerability is often seen as a weakness. If you're vulnerable, you're weak or you're soft. But the reality is, actually, when it comes to storytelling and leadership, the more vulnerable you are, and the more vulnerable stories that you can tell, in many ways, is a sign of power and strength. And so, I think that's the challenge for folks is anyone who wants to be a storyteller is to try to uncover the stories in your business, in your life, in the people in your organization that are the hard stories to tell. I like to say that if the challenge or the transformation of the hero in your story or the people in your story or the business you're talking about, if that challenge or transformation doesn't scare you a little bit to tell or to talk about, then it's probably not going to be a compelling or powerful story. You want to feel, you're telling a good story when before you press publish, you feel a little nervous about it. Like, am I revealing too much? Am I exposing too much about myself?
Right.
And the reason I say that is that in many ways, a lot of people think great storytelling is about reflecting on your own life or your own experience. But the reality is the best stories out there are actually a mirror to your audience, a mirror to the world. If you think about the stories that, Savannah, that you appreciate the most, they're the ones where you actually see yourself in the midst of that story.
Great.
And so that's what I really encourage people to do is be vulnerable, be brave, and at the end of the day, if you do both of those things, you'll provoke some pretty amazing stories that not only start new conversations, but maybe change the conversation that needs changing.
Wow. Okay. So speaking of vulnerability and in telling compelling stories, in just 4 months, COVID-19 has spread in over 177 countries with cases almost at 800,000 and over 2 billion people in lockdown. What do you think on the way? What are your thoughts on the way different leaders around the world have handled the crisis?
Well, it's a very important question, Savannah. And first, as challenging as this entire situation is, and it's an unprecedented situation, I've actually been very impressed with the compassion, preemptiveness, and efforts of the business and the education community.
Right.
There are hundreds of examples of companies, both large and small, that have directed their employees to work remotely and that are offering supplemental compensation and healthcare benefits and refusing to lay off those employees, not because the government is mandating it, because they're staying true to their purpose. They're staying true to their mission.
Right.
Companies like Starbucks, who I used to work for, is doing that. Microsoft, the list goes on. There are also many companies that are looking outwards beyond their own employees and are looking for ways where they can use their scale, their financial resources, their expertise, their innovation as a force for good in the broader community. Google's a great example of that. Just this week, they announced a $800 million commitment to help small businesses and healthcare workers through a combination of ad credits for their Google search advertising, as well as direct cash support. Mercedes-Benz, I just read the other day, asked their luxury car engineers to turn away from designing cars for a little bit and design a next generation respirator. They ended up doing it in 100 hours. Wow. So you had luxury car engineers who used their amazing mechanical and innovative minds to go from, again, designing luxury, some of the best and most elegant luxury vehicles in the world, right, to designing a life-saving next-generation respirator. And it's not just large businesses, it's small businesses. There's actually a small luxury handbag designer in New York called Atelier.
Okay.
It was actually founded by a former colleague of mine, Stephanie Sarka. She's offered to turn her handbag factory in New York City, which is the epicenter of the virus in New York or in the U.S. right now, to offer up her handbag factory and the sewers that work there to start making medical masks. So again, here you have a organization, a small startup that's only 2 years old, and just trying to get its footing in the midst of a crisis that, under any circumstances, would probably put them out of business. And she's stepping up and offering, her factory, her resources, her team to help in this crisis.
Wow. Okay. So while the governments in their own ways are trying to help small businesses and entrepreneurs in this time of crisis, what would be your advice to our listeners on how they could respond to COVID-19 or any other crisis for what it is?
Well, at first, I would say stay healthy.
Definitely, yeah.
You're not helping anyone. You're not, no matter how heroic you might think you are as a leader or as an employee, you're not helping anybody by, especially yourself and your family, by not following the safety guidelines being requested by governments and World Health Organizations. So stay home, stay healthy, and next, stay connected. This is a fantastic opportunity for people to reach out to people, family members, and others that they may not have talked to in a while.
Yeah.
It's important to stay connected with those that are on your team and those that you regularly work with your boss and your direct teams. But don't forget about those that you've maybe neglected to talk to over time. They could be friends that you haven't talked to, family members. I had not talked to my parents in a few months, and just talked to them this weekend, and it was great.
Wow.
And so it's sometimes this is a horrible situation, but on the other hand, I do think there are some amazing rekindled relationships, and even new relationships that are going to be started out of this. It's a great opportunity to reach out to that person on your team that you maybe walked past in the hallway or sat at a different table next to in the cafeteria, and to just reach out and say, I know we didn't really talk much around the office, but I just wanted to check in and make sure you're okay. So stay connected, and if you're a leader, do it frequently with your teams, do it in an empathetic way, and do it in a transparent and honest way. And finally, take care of your employees. If you're a leader or whether you be on the political side or the government side, and your community.
Yeah.
This is going to be a defining moment for companies and leaders of all stripes. When we come out of this, I really do believe that companies' brands and leaders' reputations will be defined by how they responded to this crisis. You may have. I like to say that it's easy to lead in good times,
Right.
But in challenging times like we're facing right now, you'll find that true leadership really reveals itself in very powerful ways.
Very true. Well, Jim, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Really appreciate the little gems that you've dropped for us today, talking about the framework. We've talked about, how to craft a compelling story and what have you. We do appreciate the work that you do for us here at AOU. And I hope that the advice that you've given us sort of spills over after crisis and even beyond. So, thanks.
Thank you, Savannah, for having me on, and I wish you, your family, and everyone listening good health.
Thank you so much. All right, then.